it's important times, right? If people in this moment can't start taking politics a little more seriously and see it less as a personality contest and more as Armageddon, then we're doing something wrong.
Yeah, sadly, I think you're right. The personality contest continues to inform people's decision making, even if they don't want to admit it. And campaigning and the media ecosphere is an important part of this, Anthony Davis. And right now, and certainly in the short run that she's had, I'd say Kamala Harris has benefited a bit from both this pent-up enthusiasm that's there on the Democratic side, but also maybe the media had a little latent enthusiasm for something new, something apart from Joe Biden. So when he stepped back, they're all there. But now the media is clapping back, right? They want their piece of Kamala Harris in a sit-down.
Yeah, I think so. And she should not sit down with the networks. I mean, she has absolutely no reason to do that. The networks have failed to do proper journalism in this, in the last decade, it seems, certainly with them emboldening Trump and putting Trump on a pedestal as they have. And so, yeah, I like the fact that Kamala Harris knows this. And I like the fact that when she comes into contact with the press, normally at some kind of at a gathering or informal conference, she's like, she's not generous with them. She's like, leave me alone. And even Biden's doing that now. He's like, go write something good. And I really feel like it's about time that politicians, instead of desperately courting the media, actually realize that there is life outside of the media because of social media and because of independent media and because of all these other platforms. So, yeah, I just don't think Kamala Harris should be doing debates. I don't think she should be doing any kind of sit down with the press, especially Meet the Press and these types of shows that are just painful these days to watch. Just agony. Do you get the same feeling as me when I watch these shows? I'm just like, what is happening here? This is so dated.
Well, it's a legacy show. Yeah. I'm stuck between finding it my comfort viewing because I grew up with it. My house, grew up in Washington, D.C., and there was just tons of politics in my house always, Yeah. But realizing is the thing I'm stuck with, that it's all garbage because you have the surrogates on there. I mean, you have Donna Brazile, for example, in the case of ABC, and then they have the surrogate. They had Chris Christie, but now it's a different guy. And I mean, they're competent, but they represent such predictable positions, and you're just hearing essentially pieces of campaign stump speeches. You get no Reince Priebus on there. I mean, it's objectionable in the extreme. So my point is, in mentioning that, you get no light, you only get heat,
and they're fake as well. You and I have worked in the media long enough to know that when you get into these environments that require large crews and an environment where you have to have a script effectively in order for everything to work, the cameras need to know, and there's a director, and so it is a production. And the advantage of independent media is that we don't need to have a crew of thousands in order to get to the point. And I think that, my least favorite thing about network is when they say, we've run out of time. And it's like, well, there shouldn't be a clock on this. But because they've got commercial breaks to go to and because they're on a network, and at the end of the day, running out of time is the worst excuse for not doing proper journalism. In the same way that pre-printed questions infuriate me in this environment. Because if the answer that you get given off the first question takes you in a new direction, go with it. Don't go back to your questions that were written by an intern 3 days ago. And invariably, I fear that is what's happening in network.
Yeah, I mean, that might be a bit of an extreme interpretation, but I do accept your point, which is that oftentimes, because of time constraints and other sort of considerations, you don't end up with what is sort of an organic back and forth, and that there are any follow-ups. And I would just say this, and then I'd like to move on. But on the question of her sitting down, you and I are in agreement on this, and I've been saying, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I don't get why she'd sit down with this media for a gotcha interview with Lester Holt or whomever. I don't get it. She's not an empty suit. You can tell by her track record that she's not. I mean, she's risen to some of the highest levels of political life, and you don't get there being a DA, a senator. You don't get there by being an empty suit and sleeping your way to the top, or whatever the other crap that I sometimes
Especially
see.
as a person of color.
Thank you.
As
and
a
a
person
woman.
of color
A woman.
and as a woman, right, in this country. It is twice as hard as a woman. It is 3 times as hard as a person of color. It is 4 times as hard being a person of color and female to get where she's got. And, you know, the fact that Trump especially just kind of criticizes her, and, you know, there is this, it's so frustrating because, you know, people criticize her because they don't think she did enough as vice president. Do you know how awful that job is? You know, like you can't do anything as vice president. You just have to wait. Wait for somebody to die.
Right. It's like being in the understudy in the theater, you know.
Yeah, exactly that. And so now I've noticed that since she's not got the Joe Biden shackles on anymore, we're starting to really see who she is. Her personality's coming through, and she's not frightened because she is ambitious. She's not frightened to show that ambition. And you need that if you're running for president. So, no, I think, you know, she is the right person in this moment at the right time, and I know that she will be successful. Whether Trump concedes defeat or not is another question.
Yeah, Anthony Davis feels that she will win. I'm less completely convinced of that, although I do think this is an election that will be punctuated by all sorts of issues that don't have to do with a direct counting of votes. I mean, I think it's going to end up in the courts. We'll talk about that in a second. But I just wanted to mention the John Adams quote, which I love. You know, he was vice president and, as you know, one of the fathers of our nation. My country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. He was talking about the vice presidency. Again, you do nothing but wait for the president to have the bad day where the president goes away and now you're president. I wanted to ask you about what's happening in Georgia. Finally, the flank of lawyers who need to handle a lot of what's planned in Georgia, which is the lack of certification of the vote, have shown up, and they're challenging in court this whole strategy. I wonder if you could speak to that for a moment.
I'm not an expert on this, but I recognize that Georgia is a test location, isn't it? It's a test district for whether or not our democracy will hold. And we have all the history with Trump and Brad Raffensperger and, you know, find me votes and refusing to certify. I think that is the blueprint for what Trump and the Heritage Foundation are planning for this November. This idea of not certifying the election, kicking it back to the courts, and as you alluded to earlier. And so what I'm hoping in Georgia is that if they can get their house in order, then it might suggest to those who are behind this scheme to cheat in November that actually it won't be as simple as they think. Because, you know, I look to Kevin Roberts, who runs the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025, and he's been saying, oh, you know, we've got a plan and they don't know what's coming and we've got it all sewn up. And I think that they have reassured Donald Trump that there is a plan in place to get him elected, and that's why he doesn't feel the need to campaign as much as is necessary. Because, you know, he can't afford to lose because he's going to prison, and he knows it. So I do think that there is this reassurance and there is this kind of far-right Christian nationalist plan, and that they think that they've worked it out. And so I'm hoping that Georgia sets the example to say, this isn't happening.
Yeah, and I don't know how you handicap the Georgia court situation because it will ultimately come down to these court cases, but the Democrats filed, I think, a 39-page legal argument, and they're trying to handle it that way to block this GOP-backed certification rule. I mean, and, you know, it's on the books now that essentially you don't have to certify the vote. And there are all these counties that have to certify votes. It's not like one central mothership in Georgia that has to. So all of these various counties, and they're Trumpies that are in all of these different spots, or many of these different spots.
There's 3 out of 5 in Georgia. There's 3 Trumpies out of the 5 member board, right? And so, it is stacked. And that's why we're saying that in these battleground states, Trump's people have tried to stack it so that it comes down to a decision that is made by MAGA Republicans. And that is terrifying.
Especially when you consider that Trump lost Georgia by, well, we know, right? 10,000-ish.
7,653 or whatever.
There you go. Yeah. So the idea that some votes would not be certified is a huge block potentially to a legitimate election. Yeah. I mean, again, this is in addition to all the other ways in which there can be issues. RFK Jr., how do you? Yeah.
Well, have you heard the news this morning about RFK Jr.?
I thought that he can't get off some of the state ballots is what I saw.
Worse than that, Trump is appointing RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, who's a former Democratic congresswoman, to be his transition team for the campaign.
I see.
So he's been elevated to the role of transition team, which in one way it kind of satisfies the fact that he wanted something to do, rather than he be put in charge of child vaccines under the Trump administration. But, Trump really feels like there is value in making use of RFK Jr. I personally think that RFK Jr. is much better off in the Trump camp and taking him out of the loop in terms of an option to vote for. And I think it frees up voters to go to Kamala Harris and choose democracy, because it was just confusing having this kind of love triangle. But
so
now
it's a net
he's
win
in the crazy
for
camp.
Net win for Kamala Harris is the way you compute it.
Isn't it interesting that people can't really decide? Like, that's how crap American politics is, that people can't decide if this third-party candidate is a good thing for the left or for the right. Like, that's how frickin' weird it is in this country. In the same way that people can't even work out who's in the lead because
Right.
It's so weird. And
Right.
that is because the system, the electoral college system, is so rigged and so complex and so badly created so badly and is so desperate for reform. But it means that you and I can disagree about who's going to win because the polls we can't even bother to look to.
Sure.
And even though
because
she's
because the people's voice is really repressed in so many ways
Yes,
in this
exactly.
country. And the irony is that we celebrate and peacock about the fact that we're the country that it was the first one that had a real representation of the people's voice as a democratic republic, that our founding fathers figured out a way and a system whereby the people could elect the president. I mean, it's absurd on its face given what we've seen.
Well, all of the systems are absurd. The filibuster is absurd. The electoral college system is absurd. This checks and balances phrase is absurd. The oversight is absurd because none of it has worked. All of these things that supposedly the U.S. has to protect it has failed because Donald Trump should have been incarcerated on the 7th of January, 2021. And yet he's running for president somehow.
I mean, there is an insanity to that on its face as well. I'm glad you mentioned Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. together because they both do something that is particularly galling to me, and that is they play. And I was mentioning before that Tulsi Gabbard is someone who does this with great credibility because of her distinguished military record and because she also speaks quite well on the stump.
Yeah.
The point that she makes, and again, RFK Jr. does it as well, is that Donald Trump didn't get us into any wars. I want to end these forever wars. And then they expand from there. But that really doesn't take stock of what Trump did under his presidency or even want to do under his presidency.
Well, the problem is it's so much of the rhetoric is untrue. So when Trump says there was no war under me, he's lying. He's absolutely lying. I mean, the conflict we're seeing in Gaza right now is courtesy of Donald Trump. The conflict we're seeing in Ukraine now is courtesy of Donald Trump. The conflict in Yemen is courtesy of Donald Trump. Like, all of this stuff has an effect. And so
well, he took out Soleimani too. I mean, that was like that out of nowhere.
Yeah, he took out Soleimani as a distraction to his impeachment. If you look at the timeline, he was being impeached. He didn't want to have those negative headlines, so he thought, well, I'll do something that is going to make me look like a strong man. Says to his generals, okay, who can we kill? Soleimani, who is one of many, incidentally. The moment that Qasem Soleimani is down, there's another, another Iranian leader or military leader to take over. But the biggest issue with Soleimani was that it put the Iranians on high alert, and they accidentally identified a Ukrainian Airlines plane that was full of 150-odd passengers as an incoming missile, and they shot it down. Again, Donald Trump, inconceivably appalling at these decisions of war. And that is why someone like him, with his mental pathology and with his flawed personality, should never be commander-in-chief, because he's literally making military decisions based on vanity. It's terrifying. So all this stuff about he'll be a dictator for a day or on day one, he was a dictator for 4 years. I lived through it. You lived through it. Everything from disappearing people off the streets of Portland during a peaceful protest, gassing people outside the Capitol. All of this stuff is the behavior of a dictator. And so why the media focused on that day one thing and didn't compare him to the dictators in history, I have no idea.
Well, I also just like that you mentioned sort of the ham-fisted way in which he was handling the military, because when you get Gabbard and RFK Jr. in there, Gabbard speaks sort of to his competence as a chief executive vis-a-vis the military. That's absurd, absolutely absurd. He was talking about nuking countries. How come we have this nuclear arsenal and we don't use it? I mean, he was reckless and ill-informed or uninformed on any number of things. But again, Gabbard speaks with a sort of gravitas on these issues that is really damaging, and I think can bolster this notion that Trump has some competence, even though we know he does not.
But she was a Democrat, Mark. I mean, this is what's so crazy about it, is that, how do you switch from being a Democrat in America to following a far-right nutcase? Like, how do you make that switch and have any morals or pride or moral compass? I mean, that is what the tragedy, and of course you can say the same for RFK Jr. and his family have denounced him in his decision to endorse Donald Trump. Didn't you love the fact that he goes, I am not ending my campaign, I am suspending it. And I was like, okay, which one of those? He's like, you can vote for me, you can still vote for me, but you can't vote for me. Okay, in battleground states you can't vote for me, but elsewhere you can vote for me, but I've ended my campaign, except I haven't. I've just suspended it. I mean, I made a video about that address, of which it lasted 45 minutes. I could only get 2 minutes of material that actually was coherent. He is off the planet, that guy. I mean, this is my concern. So it's all very well putting these two in as the transition team experts, but he's nuts and she's a traitor.
I mean, the idea, look, the Trump White House was occupied by, when he won last time, family members were really influencing policy.
Yeah.
Lobbyists were influencing policy at the EPA, at Commerce, at Interior, all of those departments run by lobbyists. And of course, they had to resign because they were corrupt. It was total incompetence. Now they'll have a game plan because of Project 2025. But anyway, RFK Jr. is having trouble getting off of some of these states in which he wants to take his name off the ballot. I did want to recognize this super chat from Dennis. Dennis Fahey, first of all, a $100 super chat.
Big shout out.
It really, thank you. It makes showing up to work worthwhile today for the... Remember, several GOP Georgia politicians are in the indictment handed to Fani Willis to prosecute. She did not yet pursue them. No accident they went after her to stall that trial. Yeah, this is something else going on in Georgia, and then I'll mention this as well to David K. Johnston, who does a lot of stuff with the law, that this Fani Willis trial has been stalled and parked in so many ways, right? They talk about her issues and conflicts of interest, and there are any ways in which this Georgia trial, which really seemed on its face to have legitimacy, has been kind of sidelined.
Well, she shouldn't have stooped the prosecutor. That's number one.
Right.
We know that. This is not a good idea. And it reminds me a little bit of, a lot of these DAs, they kind of come out and they are publicly critical of Donald Trump, and he uses that. And, I just don't think that's the way to behave. I think you need to go to ground like Jack Smith did or Robert Mueller did, where nobody really knows what you think. You just get on with the business of prosecuting. So from that perspective, I'm a little annoyed with Fani Willis, but she's also allowed to have a personal life, and the prosecutor that she had a relationship with is on the same side. So what difference? I never really understood that. I couldn't see a conflict of interest anywhere. What I do see, though, is the GOP will always bring up anything that they can. Hunter Biden would never have been prosecuted if there wasn't a biased decision behind that. It's like those types of crimes don't even get heard.
Well, that was the remarkable thing to me, is that Biden, out of a desire to not have the appearance of conflict,
right,
left that special prosecutor in and actually expanded the office. They added a second attorney there to go after his own son. Do you think something like that would happen under a GOP administration?
Not in a million years. And, look, we've seen it, haven't we? We've seen it with Jared Kushner and $2 billion from the Saudis, for example. But that aside, and I should say as an aside, I really hope that Joe Biden pardons Hunter Biden in the last 7 days of his presidency. I think that absolutely has to happen. But, in terms of Georgia, it should be cut and dry, mainly because we have a recording of Donald Trump trying to extort the Brad Raffensperger. But in terms of this, the Democrats suing over these new election rules, America is a lawless country. It really is. The fact that you have to sue people in order to get justice. The law in itself does not stand up to scrutiny. Where I'm from, no one sues anybody because the law is the law. And it's like, oh, you broke the law. Okay, well, that's fine. Well, you lost, or you've been fined, or you've been incarcerated. But here it's like the law does not stand up to scrutiny because it's open to interpretation, because these DAs and prosecutors are invariably political, and judges are political and politically appointed.
Well, how are the barristers and judges?
They're not politically appointed.
They're not.
No.
So how does a judge come to power in Britain?
Well, because the judiciary is considered to be completely separate of politics. It just is. And so
you apply for, I know nothing about how this works. A judge, I'm just curious as a digression. So if I want to get a judgeship, I show my my CV, and eventually when there's an opening, I'm considered, or how does it work?
Yeah, but the decision is made by a group that is non-political.
I see.
And so, it is done, but it has nothing to do with the Attorney General, for example. The Attorney General is irrelevant in this. So I just think that you're so used to your system here that you think, well, that's how it's done everywhere. And it isn't. And so that's why you can't get justice in America, because the judiciary is political. But, ultimately the law should be the law. And so that's why we don't need to sue people in England. We just follow the law. Here, the fact that just the idea that a kind of the local authority is suing the local authority, right? That's effectively what's happening. It's like the council is suing the council. It doesn't make any sense to me. And so, the whole kind of litigious aspect to getting justice in America, the reason it's so frustrating is because invariably the only people that can afford lawyers, and therefore to get justice, are the rich. And that is why Donald Trump has not been held accountable, and that is why these lawsuits take forever, because lawyers are getting rich along the way. It's a very weird country. I wouldn't live anywhere else, but this is a weird country.
The one thing I would say is that, and I, maybe it's just because, as you say, I grew up in this system and I'm used to it, but it is the way you, quote, get justice. the way you hold corporate polluters to account, the way you hold big companies to account, the only thing they care about is money. So you sue them for big money. That's the only penalty that matters. We saw it happen in 2008. I mean, nobody went to serve an hour of prison time after these fraudulent financial vehicles were sold to so many Americans and created a market crash and created a crisis.
Whereas in Britain, they did go to prison. In Britain, there was about a dozen of these, bank bosses that were held accountable. But yeah, in the US, it just didn't happen. And so it's so interesting. We really do need to spend more time looking around the world and seeing how other nations kind of deal with criminal justice. Because it seems to me that in the US, if you're a young black man caught dealing marijuana in the wrong state, you're going to be incarcerated for potentially a decade. But if you're a wealthy white conservative with deep pockets and you get caught trying to overturn a legitimate United States election, then you get to walk free and you get to run again 4 years later.
Yeah, just insane. And what they did to those poor Georgia poll workers, those women who do the only thing that, in the case of Donald Trump, he's never done, which is public service. It was horrifying. It was horrifying. And Giuliani, of course, led that parade. So that for another time.
Well, at least they got paid out, the mother and daughter. At least they,
they got the judgment. They got the judgment.
Whether
I don't know if they're going to get the
paid
money
up or not, who knows? But the point is that, they were so proud of that job. I mean, she'd done it for years, the mum. It was like something she really looked forward to doing.
Yeah, proudly. And it's, and this is the chilling effect that it has on public service and, on others working on the polls and the election process. I mean, if you think, well, I want to, but I don't want my life, laid bare and, armed men coming to my residence, which is exactly what happened in their case. Anyway, we've got to wrap up. You know what? We're out of time. I mean,
what?
Got to go to commercials.
Find Anthony Davis on the 5 Minute News on the Midas Touch Network. He's got 3 shows, constant videos. I think you're up to 3 shows, something like that now.
Something like that, yeah.
We love your work and we love you stopping through. And there he is. That's with the good doctor who you do regular stuff with, who is essentially x-raying Donald Trump's mind. Right.
She's very impressive. Dr. Bandy Lee, who has been blacklisted from the media for telling the truth. And so we thought it would be only appropriate in these last few months before Election Day to give her a platform. So we've handed the weekend show guest slot over to her every week. And she will be joining us to, she's not analyzing Donald Trump as a patient. She says that the United States is the patient. The voters are the patients. And so that's where her analysis is. But yeah, I mean, she basically says Donald Trump is not fit for any job, let alone the presidency. And, she and a whole bunch of psychiatric experts have done an assessment of him, a proper official assessment. And he failed basic mental competency. And that's who we're dealing with.
Well, I mean, man, woman, camera, TV. I don't know how you can fight that. I mean, that seems to be all the evidence you need.
Genius.
Again, thank you, Anthony Davis. We appreciate you stopping through here. Everyone, we look forward to your next visit and seeing you on 5 Minute News and beyond at the Midas Touch Network. Anthony Davis, everybody.
Thank you, Mark.
On your feet, damn it. On your feet. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.